All right, so we're into chapter 7, right? And we are thinking about the permanent internal unhappiness that is a result of the superego, right? And the way that this superego is a product of not just the father, but of civilization in general. Uh, and I'm sorry here. Um, and this renunciation of instinct that is the cause of pain in civilization, right? That the superego makes us renounce our instinct, and that renunciation of instinct is to the benefit of society, but is a constant pain to us, right? Because we can't, however much we can disavow our instincts, we aren't able to live without them. Right? So I want to then jump in a little bit to this sort of difficult section on 124, 125, about the way that society makes us sort of inescapably unhappy. And so on 124, he's talking about sort of the normal ways that an individual overcomes the unhappiness of childhood, the traumas of childhood. And so the basic dynamics that Freud is talking about here concern the Oedipus complex, and the healthy response of a child to their parents. So the Oedipus complex is perhaps the most famous of Freud's ideas. It's an incredibly central idea to Freudian psychoanalysis. I mentioned it just in passing in a previous video, but the Oedipus complex derives from a myth from ancient Greece, or in any case, a play written by the ancient Greek playwright Sophocles. And in the play Oedipus Rex, we learn the story of Oedipus. And Oedipus is a ancient Greek who learns in maybe his teenage years, in his early teens, that he is fated to marry his mother and kill his father. Now, Oedipus, learning of this fate, leaves home, gets as far away from his family, his mother and his father, as he can, right? He's trying to escape fate. He wants to attempt to put space between himself and the parents that he's supposed to, the prophets say. The prophets say he's going to kill his parents, right? So Oedipus sets off on his way, and he leaves his home, goes to another city-state in ancient Greece. He goes to Thebes. And along the way, he gets into a confrontation with an older man and kills the older man. Then, after a series of tribulations, he solves a riddle, and by solving the riddle, lifts the plague from his new home of Thebes. As a result of this, he marries the queen. So Oedipus leaves home to avoid killing his mother and father. Along the way, he kills a man he gets into a fight with, and then he marries a woman. These people are very far removed from him. However, as the story progresses, another plague falls on, a plague falls on Thebes. And in order for the plague to be lifted, Oedipus has to discover who has murdered the king who is married to the queen who he has just married. And as he's in this process of trying to figure out the murderer, he comes across another bit of information. He learns that the queen had a child, and that child was fated to kill his father. So the queen, trying to prevent this fate, left the baby on a hillside. However, a shepherd came along, found the baby, and found a family to adopt it. So this child, who's fated to kill the king, was left for dead, but did not die. Oedipus learns that he was that child, right? That child that was abandoned by the queen, that the mother and father that he left in order to come to Thebes were his adoptive parents, not his real parents. And of course, he then puts it together that he has killed the king. The man that he killed on the road to Thebes was his king, the king and his father, and that the queen that he married after solving the riddle of the Sphinx was his mother. So there's a lot happening in this story, and right, one of the main themes, of course, is fate, and the idea being, the sort of simple moral is that you can't escape your fate, right? Whether that is putting the child up for adoption, the child is going to come back and do what it's fated to do, or it's Oedipus leaving his home, trying to avoid his fate. Right? Things are not as they appear. Your fate has a way of coming true. There are other interesting things about the story. I think it's very interesting and important that Oedipus, having just learned that he is fated to kill his father, then chooses to kill someone who is around his father's age, right? Kills a man, right? Why kill a man if the whole point is to avoid killing your father, right? The easiest way to do that would just be don't kill anyone. And the reason I think that's interesting is because I think it's a kind of nod on Sophocles' part, the playwright, that fate requires complicity to some extent. You have to participate in your own fate, and you do so unwillingly, right? And that's, I think, the larger and slightly more important and complicated underlying message. Not just that you can't escape your fate, but that you arrive at your fate unconsciously, right? That it isn't your intentional actions that bring about your fate, it's your unconscious actions. And so that is obviously appealing to Freud, right? That what leads to Oedipus's demise, he makes all of these intentional conscious choices to try to get control over his fate. But what ultimately, seals his fate is something unconscious. And it is at the level of the unconscious that fate operates, right? So for Freud, this makes a lot of sense, or it's a nice metaphor, a nice illustration of the theory of the unconscious and how the unconscious works. The unconscious is always operating alongside your conscious life, and you aren't aware, obviously, of what your unconscious is doing. the ways that your unconscious is operating. So uh, so that's the sort of basic idea of the unconscious, right? That your fate unravels through your unconscious actions. And so, you know, I think that's a really sort of beautiful idea. And then the point of psychoanalysis is to sort of get control of your unconscious to the extent possible, to be aware of what your unconscious does and to try and direct it. But Freud thinks there's some more specific substance to the Oedipus story that can teach us about sort of universal unconscious human experience. And this is that the Oedipus story reveals something essential about our relation to our parents. Right? For Freud, because the original object of our sexual desire is our mother, right? And that doesn't mean per se that we want to sleep with our mother or reproduce with our mother, but rather that the first source of pleasure is our mother. And so, metaphorically, we have a sexual drive for our mothers. And, Freud will say, and this is the way that Freud has been interpreted in popular discourse, that, in addition to this sort of clinical observation that we have the desire that our desire for pleasure is first satisfied by the mother, that also that unconscious desire for the mother, which is then translated into desires for other things, substitutes for the mother, a pacifier, a blankie, and then eventually as an adult, science and art and religion and all that. That the desire for the mother also then gets sort of translated into the desire for a wife, right? That you will end up, marrying a woman that reminds you of your mother. And there's a analogous relationship between daughter and father, also, which Freud calls the Electra complex. Where the daughter will end up marrying someone that reminds her of their father, and so that is more sort of evidence for Freud that all of our desire is a substitution for the desire for the mother. But then also, and this is more relevant to the story that Freud is telling here, the second part of the Oedipus complex and the Oedipus story is the murder of the father, right? And so for Freud, the father is that force that prohibits us from having what we want, that imposes discipline on us, and is a kind of antagonist, right? The father is a kind of antagonist, and in early childhood, throughout childhood, the father is the authority figure. So the other major sort of Freudian idea, or one of the other major Freudian ideas that has made it into the popular imagination, is this idea that you have to kill your father, right? And what Freud means by this is that in order to become a fully functioning adult, you have to become your own authority, right? You have to discipline yourself. And this is part of developing a superego. It's part of learning to control and regulate your desires. You can no longer, you can't forever have your father be the authority that tells you what to do. And so this is why teenagers, Freud thinks, or in Freudian theory, this is why teenagers rebel, right? That it is an attempt to sort of metaphorically kill your father, to escape the authority of your father, and to become your own authority figure, right? To be your own ruler, to rule your own life. Uh, and so the internalization of the father in the form of the superego uh, is a part of this killing of the father. Um, but the sort of so for Freud, right, a healthy development of the ego includes killing the father. You have to kill your father in order to become a full person, right? And so when he's talking about this uh, on page 125, right, when he's talking about those who kill their fathers and those who don't, um, he's talking about this Oedipus complex, right? And those who don't kill their fathers will always sort of feel themselves under the weight of the expectations of their parents, right? That I'm everything I do to satisfy my parents. And a healthy ego is one that is able to overcome that and sets its own goals, right? I do the things that I do for myself, not for my parents. And I set those goals with my superego, right, in large part. So when Freud is saying, right, let's read a little bit from page 124. A child who has been very leniently brought up can acquire a very strict conscience. Right, so this is sort of what he's trying to figure out. If conscience seems to be a consequence of a strict superego and therefore likely a strict father and strict upbringing, strict discipline, it's strange that those who are leniently brought up would also have strong consciences. He says, but it would also be wrong to exaggerate this independence. It is not difficult to convince oneself that severity of upbringing does also exert a strong influence on the formation of the child's superego. What it amounts to is that in the formation of the superego and the emergence of a conscience, innate constitutional factors and influences from the real environment act in combination. And so, what is it that creates a conscience? Not just the superego, not just the father, but also the constitutional factors of an ego and environmental factors. And so that would mean not just your relationship to your parents, but also things that are innate to your psyche, and then also the kind of civilization or society in which you're brought up. And then he continues, right? On 125. We cannot get away from the assumption that man's sense of guilt springs from the Oedipus complex and was acquired at the killing of the father by the brothers banded together. Now, here Freud is drawing on this other idea, or the other sort of concept of the father and killing the father that he mentions in the first chapter. And this is the moment when civilization really begins, when the simple family unit is expanded into a tribe, right? When the band of brothers kills the father. And so that itself ties into this larger analogy that Freud is making between the development of the individual and the development of civilization itself, right? So the individual has to kill the father, metaphorically, in order to become their own person, in order to set their own agenda and goals. But civilization also has this moment of father killing, which it seems is more literal, when the family unit is supplanted by this larger tribal network, which is a band of brothers, right, who have overcome their father, killed their father. And so we remember that's when civilization first begins establishing totem and taboo. And so that original moment in civilization of killing the father is a source of guilt. Just as in the individual, there's a sense of guilt for overcoming the father, right? That, for example, if your father wants you to be a doctor, right? You might become a doctor, right? And then you'll likely feel resentment, or you might feel resentment, right? Feel that you haven't actually lived your life, you've lived the life that your father wanted you to live, right? So you haven't really lived. There's a kind of guilt on behalf of yourself. And for Freud, that is unhealthy, right? For Freud, the healthier thing to do is to say, my father wants me to be a doctor, but I want to be a musician, right? To decide to abandon medicine and do music is to kill your father and to become yourself. But just because we become ourselves doesn't mean that we are then guilt-free, that we don't feel that part of the superego which is directly derived from the father, which tells us you're bad. You're bad for abandoning medicine, right? You're still going to feel that guilt. And the same is true at the level of civilization, right? That whenever we have this constant pull. The pull to abandon civilization and look out for ourselves and our families, and the pull of civilization to abandon our families and serve civilization. And so just as, sort of there is a constant and unending conflict within the individual between the expectations of the father and the desires of the individual, the same is true at the level of civilization, right? There is a constant conflict between the desires of the individual or the family and the desires of civilization at large. And these are essentially, this is a conflict that we can't overcome, and it can just be managed. So we cannot get away from the assumption that man's sense of guilt springs from the Oedipus complex and was acquired at the killing of the father by the brothers banded together. On that occasion, an act of aggression was not suppressed but carried out. And so also this overcoming the father, killing the father, is an expression of this aggression. Not suppressed but carried out. But it was the same act of aggression whose suppression in the child is supposed to be the source of his sense of guilt. And so, again, this analogy. At this point, I should not be surprised if the reader were to exclaim angrily, so it makes no difference whether one kills one's father or not, one gets a feeling of guilt in either case. Right? So even if you kill your father, become yourself, choose civilization, you're still going to feel this guilt. There is no escaping this guilt. Right, so he goes on 127. This remorse was the result of his primordial ambivalence of feeling toward the father. His sons hated him, but they loved him too. Right? And so again, this constant conflict between self and father, between family and civilization, between individual and civilization, is originally, is this original conflict within the human psyche itself between eros and death, right? Between pleasure principle and death drive. So We hate our fathers, but we also love them. We love our mothers, but we also hate them. We love civilization, but we also hate it. We love ourselves, but we also hate ourselves. And this is just an unavoidable sort of conflict. Now, that's all I need to say about chapter 7. Let's wrap it up here with chapter 8. What this constant conflict between destruction and desire, pleasure, amounts to is kind of anxiety, right? That we can say there's a kind of ambient guilt, the knowledge that no matter what we choose, we are going to feel remorse and guilt. And this is the permanent unhappiness of the superego, which is then reinforced and utilized by civilization, right, to its own ends. And this kind of ambivalence between aggression and pleasure, the knowledge that no matter what we do, we'll have some sense of guilt, is a general anxiety, right? And so this goes back again also to what Freud was saying. Civilization makes us, what was the word he used? Neurotic, sorry. Most common Freudian word. Civilization makes us neurotic, right? And whenever civilization is sort of not doing its job correctly, this anxiety, the neuroses that civilization produces become worse. So whenever civilization is not regulating that libidinal economy well enough, this anxiety is exacerbated. So let's read some of these conclusions. Right in chapter 8, this is where Freud really makes the analogy between the civilizational development and the development of an individual explicit, and he names some of the problems with it. I think I don't want to go on too much of a tangent about this, but I think this analogy is extremely problematic for Freud. Right? The idea that civilization is analogous to an individual. We mentioned this a little bit in class, right? On the one thing, it implies that civilization and the development of civilization is kind of univocal, right? Meaning that there is only one civilization and there's only one course of development for civilization. We can grasp civilization as a unified movement. And that just seems basically wrong to me. Another thing would be that this idea of an analogy between society and the individual is extremely old and relies on a number of metaphysical and philosophical assumptions that Freud should question more. This analogy is at the center of Plato's Republic, right, where he is explicitly making a comparison between the city and an individual. And the argument is that a city should try to organize itself, like a well-run city is analogous to a well-run individual. Right? If we know what it takes to manage a city, then we can manage ourselves as individuals. If we know how to rule ourselves as individuals, then we should be able to rule a city. So it's an extremely old idea, and it's interesting the extent to which Freud just continues that analogy, right? Sort of believes that analogy is valuable. But so let's read some of these conclusions, which begin on page 141 here. He writes, the development of the individual seems to us to be a product of the interaction between two urges, the urge toward happiness, which we usually call egoistic, and the urge toward union with others in the community, which we call altruistic. All right, so, right, the development of the individual, and this is, you know, in Freudian theory, this is the apotheosis of a certain strain of thought, where Freud is acknowledging the social sort of conditions that impact an individual's development. Not just the environmental conditions of the family, but the larger historical and civilizational conditions that lead to particular forms of ego development. And so now he's saying, right, that the end of this book, the conclusion, that the individual develops because of the interaction between egoistic urges, specifically the egoistic urge to happiness, and the urge toward community, right, which is an altruistic urge. And so these interactions between our desire for happiness and our desire for the good, for altruism, for a functioning society, sometimes work together and are sometimes in conflict. And that's one of the sources of discontent in civilization. Neither of these descriptions goes much below the surface. In the process of individual development, as we have said, the main accent falls mostly on the egoistic urge, or the urge towards happiness, while the other urge, which may be described as a cultural one, is usually content with the role of imposing restrictions. But in the process of civilization, things are different. Here, by far, the most important thing is the aim of creating a unity out of the individual human beings. And it is true that the aim of happiness is still there, but it is pushed into the background. It almost seems as if the creation of a great human community would be most successful if no attention had to be paid to the happiness of the individual. So here Freud is saying, right, the demands of civilization are often counter to the requirements for human happiness, individual happiness, and that generally civilization would have a much easier time if no one wanted to be happy. That seems basically right to me. Right? The idea being that, maybe in certain implies a particular understanding of civilization and perhaps belongs to a certain historical era. But this concept that, what civilization means is behaving altruistically, only acting for the good of others, for the good of the community, is a pretty traditional conception of civilization and how civilization works. And, I don't know if that's really true per se, but if we were to, say what civilization wants, it wouldn't maybe be that every individual gets what they want as individuals. It would more likely be that every individual is satisfied and is made happy by serving the community. So, I think it's a decent way to think about civilization for now. And I think it's useful in sort of thinking about, and this is Freud's points, right, is to sort of diagnose sources of discontent. It's useful to think about civilization that way, because then we understand why individuals would, sort of at the most basic level, rebel against and resent civilization, right? Because civilization demands that we put uh, the restrictions of civilization before our individual happiness. And as individuals, we resent that. And so the problem with civilization is that it's made up of individuals, and individuals are not on their own naturally part of civilization. Right? That seems to be the idea. So he'll then go on to say in 142, but the struggle between the individual and society is not a derivative of the contradiction, probably an irreconcilable one, between the primal instincts of eros and death. It is a dispute within the economics of the libido, comparable to the contest concerning the distribution of libido between ego and objects. And it does admit of an eventual accommodation in the individual, as it may be hoped it will also do in the future of civilization, however much that civilization may oppress the life of the individual today. Right, so Freud is saying civilization today is oppressive of the individual. I don't think that's true of contemporary America. Oh boy, here comes a tangent. I'll just say that I think that the kinds of satisfaction that American society offers to individuals are satisfactions that don't actually serve the individual as individual. That we celebrate the individual and we say that we respect the individual and let the individual be the individual, give the individual as many choices as possible, right? Individual choice. We worship the individual in American society. The individual is the all-powerful sort of category. But what is it that the individual is really allowed to do? And we can think back to our end here, I think. What would the kinds of happiness that are offered to the individual are consumer happinesses, right? Satisfactions of consumerism, by and large, for the most part. And that consumerism is a kind of mania for substitution from a Freudian perspective, right? That we desire satisfaction, the kind of satisfaction that we get from the mother or from love or from genuine purpose that we might find in science or art or religion. And we aren't really offered that kind of satisfaction. The kinds of satisfaction that the all-important individual is offered and the way that the person is catered to as an individual is as a consumer, right? And so we buy endless stuff to try to find that satisfaction. But that is a bad, and this is bringing us finally back to Freud, a bad regulation of the libidinal economy. So that, well, let's return to this passage on 142. Right? The dispute is not between the instincts of eros and death. Not the struggle between individual and society is not the same as the struggle between eros and death. It's dispute within the economics of the libido. It's whether or not I'm able to satisfy my libido. And that might mean something kind of straightforward, right? Am I allowed to have the object of my sexual desire, right? Is homosexuality accepted? Is interracial marriage accepted, uh, those sorts of things. Uh, a society that prevents you from pursuing those desires is one that maybe is overly strict, or you know imposes an economics system of regulation on your libido that's too strict. Uh, and so, but we could also expand this and say, the economics of libido require not just that you have this sexual outlet, but that there are meaningful alternative outlets for sexual desire, right? Because remember, the greatest danger, or one of the greatest dangers, next to aggression and the death drive, is the individual who is unable to attain the object of their desire. What do we do with the person who can't have the person they love and desire for whatever reason? That person needs an outlet, right? And the job of civilization is to give that person an outlet, both so that person can continue to be, have some kind of happiness, be helpful, useful, but also so that person doesn't become a danger to others and to civilization as a whole. And when there aren't meaningful outlets, right, and as I talked about in the last video, right, the sort of rarefication of art and science and the degradation and sort of calumny against religion, all make those sort of outlets less available. And I think we could quite reasonably argue, and Freud would argue this also at the very end. He says, let's not even think about Americans. The Americans are such a mess. But we could say, that the outlets that are available are not ones that provide us with true libidinal satisfaction. Right? Consumerism does not offer true libidinal satisfaction. Entertainment does not provide libidinal satisfaction. And so, from a Freudian perspective, civilizational deterioration of the kind that we are experiencing now is a product of sort of mass libidinal frustration. And that mass libidinal frustration is caused by a failed economics of the libido. That this energy is not being given a place to go, it's not being channeled, and therefore it's either being painfully frustrated and causing misery, or that bottled up energy is getting released in violent, aggressive outbursts against civilization. I think you can interpret the whole rise of far-right sort of authoritarian politics in the 2010s, Trump, Bolsonaro, but then in Europe, in Indonesia, as a kind of explosion of this frustrated libidinal energy, and this sort of backlash against neoliberalism, global capitalism, and all of that, which is coming in response to Trump and these far right authoritarians. That is an attempt to change the economics of libido. That if people just were able to live sort of dignified lives, right? If they were given true outlets for their libidinal energy, rather than just sort of trying to consume themselves into satisfaction, that maybe we wouldn't have this sort of the politics of revenge and resentment and sort of brutish explosion that is this far right resurgence. Um, all right, so that's I didn't mean to end on politics, but I think it's an interesting. We need as many tools as we can get to understand our moment and what's happening here, right? Uh, but I think that'll do it for civilization and its discontents. And all right, see you next week.